What if Israel's most dangerous long-term rival is not the enemy that openly threatens it, but the powerful state that keeps growing right next to the battlefield? What if the next great pressure on Israel is coming not from a sworn outsider, but from a NATO member that is richer, closer, smarter, and far harder to predict? Before we go any further, hit like, subscribe, and share this with the one friend who loves the real story behind world events, not just the loudest headline. At first, that idea sounds wrong. For years, almost every serious conversation about Israel's future came back to one word: Iran. Iran's missiles, Iran's nuclear program, Iran's proxy forces in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Gaza. Iran was the threat that shaped Israeli planning, Israeli speeches, and Israeli fear. And to be clear, Iran still matters. A lot. No Israeli planner can just forget about Tehran. But something has changed. Quietly at first, then more openly, Turkey began moving from the edge of the picture to the center of it. Not because Turkey suddenly became more ideological than Iran, not because Turkey is about to attack tomorrow morning, but because Turkey is becoming something far more difficult in the long run. A capable rival with geography, industry influence, and ambition all pointing in the same direction. That is the key to this entire story. Iran is dangerous because it is hostile. Turkey is dangerous because it is becoming harder to stop. And when you understand that difference, the whole map starts to look different. The first clue is where attention is going. When a country tells you who scares it, listen. But when it spends time, money, and political energy on something else, pay even closer attention. That usually reveals the deeper worry. In recent years, even as Iran remained a major threat, more and more Israeli discussion started turning toward Turkey. Not always in public, not always in the loudest way, but enough to notice. Why? Because power in the Middle East is not only about who hates whom, it is about who is rising, who is building, and who is putting themselves in the center of every future crisis. Turkey has been doing exactly that. This was not the old Turkey of the 1990s, when Ankara and Jerusalem often worked quietly together and their rivalry felt limited. This is a Turkey that wants strategic independence, a Turkey that wants to build its own weapons, shape Syria's future, influence the Eastern Mediterranean, speak for the Palestinian cause, and still remain important to Washington and NATO at the same time. That combination is what makes it so uncomfortable for Israel, because a clear enemy is easier to plan for than a shifting rival. Think about it this way. Iran has spent years telling Israel exactly what it is. It backs armed groups that fight Israel. It invests heavily in missiles and drones. It built a whole regional strategy around pressure, deterrence, and ideological confrontation. That is frightening, but it is also simple in one important sense. You know where Iran stands. You know what it wants. You know the broad shape of the game. Turkey is different. Turkey can host talks one month and deliver thunderous anti-Israel speeches the next. It can condemn Israel over Gaza while still trying to protect its own economic interests. It can speak like a moral challenger, act like a regional broker, and build like a military power all at once. It is not one fixed thing, and that makes it harder to box in. For Israeli planners, uncertainty is not a side issue. Uncertainty is the issue. Now add military power to that uncertainty, and the concern becomes easier to understand. Turkey is not a small state throwing angry words from a distance. It has one of NATO's largest militaries. Its geography matters. Its coastline matters. Its access to Syria matters. Its ability to influence the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and parts of the Arab world matters. And in the last several years, Ankara has pushed hard to reduce dependence on outside suppliers and grow its own defense industry. That effort is no longer theoretical. Turkey became a major drone power. Turkish drone-s changed battlefields in places like Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Ukraine. Those systems did more than win export deals. They changed how other countries think about Turkey. Ankara was no longer just a customer buying weapons from the West. It was becoming a supplier with real engineering depth and real battlefield credibility. Then came the next step, fighter power. For years, Turkey wanted the F-35, the most advanced American stealth fighter in the region outside Israel. But Ankara bought the Russian S-400 air defense system, and that decision triggered a crisis with Washington. The logic from the American side was simple. You cannot operate one of the West's most sensitive stealth aircraft next to a Russian radar system built to study exactly that kind of aircraft. So Turkey was removed from the F-35 program. That should have been a major strategic defeat. In one sense, it was. Turkey lost access to the aircraft. It lost industrial participation. It lost time. But Ankara did not freeze. Instead, it used the shock as a lesson. If the West could lock a door, then Turkey needed to build its own house. That is where the deeper shift begins. Turkey kept chasing ways back into advanced fighter access, but it also accelerated its domestic path. Its KAAN fifth-generation fighter project moved from a dream on paper to a real test program. Turkish officials said defense and aviation exports passed $10 billion in 2025. They also pointed to a planned serial production contract for KAAN in 2026. Indonesia then signed a major deal covering 48 KAAN aircraft, with delivery planned over 10 years. Even if the aircraft takes time to not sign deals like that with a state they think is unserious. So Israel is not just watching a neighbor buy hardware. It is watching a neighbor build an ecosystem. And ecosystems are harder to defeat than single weapons. This is where many people misunderstand the rivalry. They think the fear is simply that Turkey might get the F-35 and suddenly match Israel in the air. That is too shallow. The real issue is trend lines. Israel still has a major qualitative edge. Its air force is more experienced in long-range operations. Its intelligence system is deeper. Its version of the F-35 is more integrated into its own military doctrine. Its pilots are battle-tested. Its command structure is sharper than most forces in the region. But strategy is not only about today's gap. Strategy is about whether the gap is narrowing. And from Israel's point of view, Turkey is one of the few countries in the region with the size, resources, industrial base, and ambition to keep narrowing it over time. That is why the F-35 story matters so much. Not because one delivery changes everything overnight, but because it sends a message. If Washington seriously reopens the door for Turkey, then Israel is forced to think about something it hates thinking about, the end of exclusivity. For decades, Israel lived with a deep strategic comfort. It was America's closest security partner in the region. It often got top technology first. It often enjoyed a military edge that nearby states simply could not challenge. That edge was not just about weapons. It was about status. It was about trust. It was about being treated as the one regional actor whose superiority should be protected almost by default. A stronger Turkish Air Force backed by improved ties with Washington touches all of that. It tells Israel that America may still be committed to it, but not in a way that guarantees permanent military loneliness at the top. That is a psychological change as much as a military one. And psychology matters in strategy more than most people realize. States do not panic only when they are weak. Sometimes they get most nervous when they sense the future becoming less comfortable than the past. Israel knows how to think about Iran. It has built doctrine around Iran for decades. It has spent years preparing for missile attacks, proxy wars, covert operations, and the nuclear question. Iran is dangerous, but familiar. Turkey feels different because Turkey creates new questions. What happens if Ankara regains access to more advanced Western aviation? What happens if KAAN succeeds enough to give Turkey prestige, exports, and a stronger air force in the 2030s? What happens if Turkey deepens military reach into Syria while speaking as a defender of Palestinian rights? What happens if Washington keeps needing Turkey for NATO strategy, Black Sea politics, and regional diplomacy, even while Israel and Turkey drift further apart? Those questions do not have easy answers. And that is exactly why they linger. Because once a threat stops being just a headline and starts becoming a long trend, every future choice feels heavier, sharper, and more expensive. If this breakdown is helping you see the bigger chessboard, take 2 seconds to subscribe, tap the like button, and send this video to someone who wants depth instead of recycled talking points. Nowhere is this rivalry more dangerous than Syria. Syria is where geography stops being theory and becomes direct pressure. Israel and Turkey do not need to declare war on each other to clash there. They simply need to pursue their own interests in the same broken country. And that is already happening. After the fall of Assad, Syria became an open contest over what kind of state would emerge. From Turkey's point of view, a stable, centralized Syria is useful. Ankara wants influence in Damascus. It wants to prevent Kurdish armed actors near its border from solidifying power. It wants refugee return to become more realistic, and it wants to keep hostile actors from using Syrian chaos against Turkish interests. Israel sees the map differently. A strong, unified Syria under leadership aligned with Turkish preferences is not comforting to Jerusalem. Israeli thinking has often favored a weaker Syria over a more consolidated one that could eventually host hostile forces, advanced weapons, or a Turkish-backed order unfriendly to Israel. The difference matters because it means both countries can look at the same event and see opposite futures. When Turkey sees stabilization, Israel may see a threat. When Israel sees pressure on Syria, Turkey may see sabotage. That is a recipe for repeated friction. This is what long-term rivalry often looks like in the real world. Not one giant dramatic battle, 1,000 moves around the edges of a collapsing space. And Syria offers Turkey something Iran never had in the same way: proximity with legitimacy. Iran's influence in Syria was powerful, but it was always burdened by distance, sectarian politics, sanctions, and open Israeli hostility. Turkey has a border with Syria. It has direct channels. It has forces, networks, and leverage on the ground. It can claim security interests that the world at least understands, even if many states do not like how Ankara pursues them. That makes Turkey more embedded, and a rival that is embedded is harder to push out. Then there is the Gaza factor, which adds another layer. President Erdogan has used fierce language against Israel, especially during the Gaza war. He has called out Israeli actions in moral terms that resonate across much of the Muslim world. For many audiences, that raises Turkey's profile. It makes Ankara look bold. It makes Erdogan look like a leader willing to say what others will not. But the story does not stop there. For a long time, rhetoric and economic reality did not always match. Turkey and Israel restored diplomatic ties in 2022, and even after tensions rose again, trade links and practical interests remained part of the picture. In 2024, Turkey announced trade restrictions on Israel, and the relationship deteriorated further. That showed the split was becoming more serious. Still, the broader lesson remained. Turkey tries to keep multiple roles alive at once. That is one reason Ankara is so hard to read from Jerusalem. It does not behave like a state that wants only confrontation. It behaves like a state that wants leverage, and leverage is often more durable than outrage. This is also why calling Turkey the new Iran misses the point. Turkey is not Iran. It is not trying to copy Iran's model. It does not need militias across the region to become a strategic headache for Israel. It has official diplomacy, formal alliances, trade networks, a large military, a growing defense industry, and access to Western systems that Iran could only dream of. In other words, Turkey can compete inside the system while also pressuring it. That is a much more sophisticated challenge, and it creates a strange situation for Israel. With Iran, the mission is obvious: deter, disrupt, weaken, expose, prepare. With Turkey, the mission is murkier. You cannot simply isolate a NATO member the way you isolate Iran. You cannot treat Ankara like a pariah when Washington, European capitals, and Arab states still need to talk to it. You cannot bomb your way out of Turkey's relevance. That is the uncomfortable truth. Turkey does not need to defeat Israel in battle to become one of Israel's hardest long-term problems. It just needs to remain unavoidable. And Ankara is getting better at exactly that. It matters in NATO. It matters in migration politics. It matters in Black Sea security. It matters in Syria. It matters in Eastern Mediterranean energy arguments. It matters in drone exports. It matters in defense manufacturing. It matters in Muslim public opinion. It matters in any regional conversation where Gaza, Syria, or Western military access enters the room. Once a country becomes that central, its power is no longer measured only in tanks and jets. It is measured in how difficult it is for others to plan without it. That is where Turkey is heading. And for Israel, that may be the most unsettling part of all. Because Israel built part of its regional success on being the one state everyone ultimately had to factor in. The one with unmatched intelligence, the one with unmatched reach, the one with unmatched air dominance, the one Washington trusted most when the stakes were highest. Turkey is not replacing Israel in that role, but it is making a bid to become impossible to ignore beside it. That creates overlap, and overlap creates rivalry. Now let's go one level deeper, because this is where the story becomes more serious. The most dangerous rival is not always the loudest. Sometimes it is the one whose rise changes the choices available to everyone else. Imagine the next decade from Israel's point of view. Iran remains damaged but not gone. Hezbollah remains a factor, even if weakened. Syria is unstable but being rebuilt in fragments. Arab states continue balancing relations with Washington, China, Israel, and each other. The United States becomes more selective about where it spends power. In that world, Israel still wants freedom of action. It still wants deterrence. It still wants regional superiority. Now place Turkey inside that same picture. A Turkey with more drones, more exports, more indigenous technology, and perhaps a stronger fighter fleet. A Turkey that can coordinate with Qatar, talk to Europe, trade influence with Washington, and lean on shared causes that stir emotion across the region. A Turkey that can pressure Kurdish groups in Syria, challenge Greek and Cypriot claims in the Mediterranean, criticize Israel over Gaza, and still insist it is an essential Western ally. That is not a passing annoyance. That is a structural rival. And structural rivals are the ones that shape long budgets, long alliances, and long anxieties. Here's another reason Turkey worries Israeli planners. Iran has ceilings. Sanctions choke its economy. Its alliances are narrow. Its military industry is impressive in some areas, especially missiles and drones, but weaker in others. Its access to Western technology is heavily restricted. Its model is built on resistance more than integration. Turkey has fewer of those limits. Its economy has serious problems. Yes, inflation and currency weakness are real. Politics inside Turkey can be turbulent, but Ankara still has access, legitimacy, and room to maneuver that Iran does not. It can bargain with the West instead of existing entirely outside it. It can threaten to turn east without fully leaving the Western system. It can upset Washington and still remain too important to discard. And from Israel's perspective, it is risky power because it means Turkey can lose one lane and keep advancing through another. If the United States keeps the F-35 door shut, Turkey pushes harder on KAAN, Eurofighters, F-16 upgrades, drones, engines, and missile defense. If Washington opens the door even a little, Turkey gains not just aircraft but prestige. If Ankara faces pressure in one theater, it can compensate in another. That is what mature rivals do. They diversify. And Turkey is learning to diversify its strategic options. That is why this contest cannot be judged by one summit, one sanctioned fight, or one burst of rhetoric. It has to be judged by pattern. And the pattern is clear. When one route narrows, Turkey looks for another. When one deal stalls, it builds somewhere else. When one arena becomes costly, it shifts pressure to the next arena. That is not the behavior of a frustrated side actor. It is the behavior of a state trying to become strategically permanent. If you want more videos that turn confusing power struggles into clear stories, leave a like, join the channel, and pass this along to one person who always wants the deeper pattern, not the shallow take. So where does this go next? There are really only two broad paths, and neither gives Israel total comfort. Path one is the obvious one. Washington slowly repairs defense ties with Ankara. Maybe not all at once, maybe not cleanly, maybe Congress resists, maybe the S-400 issue remains a major obstacle. But over time, some formula emerges that reduces the freeze, expands military cooperation, or reopens access to systems Turkey has wanted for years. If that happens, Israel does not suddenly become weak. But it does lose some strategic ease. It has to lobby harder in Washington. It has to strengthen ties with Greece and Cyprus even more. It has to think carefully about how much freedom Turkey might gain in the air and in diplomacy. And most of all, it has to accept that American strategy may keep making room for a state Israel increasingly sees as a competitor. That is a hard pill to swallow if you built decades of confidence around the idea that your military edge would remain uniquely protected. Path two is that Washington does not go that far. The F-35 stays blocked. Congress stays skeptical. The S-400 issue never fully dies. Turkey keeps hearing no. But even that does not solve Israel's problem, because Turkey has already adapted to the possibility of long-term exclusion. It has built its own drone empire. It is pushing domestic fighter development. It is deepening export markets. It is trying to create the very thing that makes sanctions less powerful over time. Internal capability. That means a closed door in Washington does not end Turkish momentum. It just changes the route. And that may be the central lesson here. This rivalry is not about one deal, one speech, or one battlefield. It is about a shift in balance that neither side fully controls anymore. Israel cannot erase Turkey's geography. Turkey cannot erase Israel's military sophistication. The United States cannot easily satisfy both at once. And Syria keeps giving them new reasons to compete. That is why this is a long-term story. And long-term stories are usually the ones people underestimate because they do not explode all at once. They unfold, they tighten, they slowly turn from tension into structure. When historians look back, they may not say the rivalry truly began with one dramatic crisis. They may say it grew out of many smaller facts that, together, changed the region. Turkey's defense rise, the collapse of the old Syrian order, the Gaza shock, the strain in Israeli-Turkish diplomacy, the question of American priorities, and the end of the assumption that Israel would always face weaker neighboring air powers. That last point is bigger than it sounds. For a long time, Israel's military edge was not just real, it felt permanent. Turkey's rise does not erase that edge today, but it does challenge the feeling of permanence. And once permanence disappears, every planner starts living in the future. So, is Turkey already a greater immediate threat to Israel than Iran? Not exactly. Iran's still carries enormous danger. Its missile force matters. Its networks matter. Its ability to trigger regional escalation matters. But if the question is who may become Israel's more dangerous long-term rival, the answer starts to look much less surprising. It is the country with industrial momentum. The country trying to shape Syria from the ground up. The country that can criticize Israel and still speak to Washington. The country building drones, fighters, exports, and influence at the same time. The country that is close enough to matter every day, not just in moments of crisis. That country is Turkey. And the reason that matters is not because war between them is inevitable. It is because rivalry between them is becoming structural. It is entering the bones of the region. Israel knows how to handle enemies that declare themselves. What keeps strategists awake is the rival that rises within the system, gains room to move, and keeps changing the future before anyone can lock the map down. That is why Turkey is becoming such a serious long-term challenge for Israel, not because it is louder than Iran, not because it is more openly hostile than Iran, but because it may prove more adaptable, more legitimate, more embedded, and more difficult to contain. And in geopolitics, the rival that is hardest to contain is often the one that matters most in the end. So the real question is not whether Israel still worries about Iran. Of course it does. The real question is this. When Israeli leaders think about the next 10 years, not the next 10 days, which country do they see steadily gaining weight, reach, and options? Answer is becoming clearer. And if it keeps becoming clearer, then the next Middle East struggle will not only be about the enemies Israel has always known, it will also be about the rival it once thought it understood. Because the most dangerous long-term rival is not always the one charging at you with a clenched fist. Sometimes it is the one building factories, shaping borders, winning influence, and making sure every future crisis leads back to its door. That is Turkey's opportunity. And from Israel's point of view, that is exactly the danger